The gun was already pressed against Noah Ralston's chest when Violet Mercer realized she was the one who had led him into the trap. She stood frozen in the doorway of the Silver Creek Saloon, the afternoon sun cutting hard angles through the dust-crusted windows, her breath caught somewhere between her throat and her lungs. Across the room, three men she recognized, men she had trusted, men who had smiled at her at Sunday services and tipped their hats in the street, had Noah backed against the bar with nowhere left to run. The tallest of them, a broad-shouldered man named Cutter Dane, pressed the barrel of a Colt revolver directly into Noah's sternum, and his smile was the coldest thing Violet had ever seen in her 23 years of living. "You walked right into it," Cutter said, his voice low and satisfied, the way a man sounds when a plan he has been nursing for months finally snaps shut like a bear trap. "And she brought you here herself." Noah's jaw was tight, his dark eyes scanning the room with the calculated stillness of a man who was afraid, but refused to let that fear become visible. His hands were raised slightly at his sides, his hat pushed back, a bruise already rising along his left cheekbone from where one of Cutter's men had caught him coming through the back entrance. He had not looked at Violet yet. That was the part that nearly broke her. Noah, his name came out of her mouth like something she had dropped and could not catch. "I did not know. I swear to you I did not know." He looked at her then, and what she saw in his eyes was not anger. It was worse than anger. It was the slow, terrible collapse of trust, and it was the most devastating thing she had ever witnessed, because over the past 6 weeks, Noah Ralston's trust had become the most valuable thing in her world. The room held its breath. Dust moved through the shafts of light. Outside on the main street of Copperfield, Texas, in the spring of 1881, horses stood at hitching posts, and children chased a dog past the general store, and the world went on entirely unaware that inside the Silver Creek Saloon, everything that Violet Mercer had quietly, desperately begun to hope for was on the verge of being destroyed. And it had started, as so many things in the wild, sun-scorched heart of Texas started, with a letter. 6 weeks earlier, Violet had arrived in Copperfield with $42 sewn into the hem of her traveling coat, one trunk of belongings, and a secret that would have gotten her run out of town before she had even unpacked. She had come from St. Louis, where she had spent the last 2 years working as a bookkeeper for a shipping company owned by a man named Gerald Whitmore. Gerald Whitmore was precisely the kind of man who believed that the law bent around him the way rivers bent around stone, without complaint and without consequence. He was also the kind of man who, when a young woman in his employ discovered that he had been systematically defrauding the families of deceased rail workers out of their insurance settlements, responded not with shame, but with a carefully constructed campaign to ruin her completely. By the time Violet understood what was happening, Whitmore had already spoken to 3 newspapers and 2 city aldermen. He had told them that she was the one who had tampered with the books, that she was a thief, that she had stolen from grieving widows. The story had the quality of a fire. It spread fast, it left nothing intact, and it did not particularly care what was true. She had left St. Louis with her reputation in pieces and Gerald Whitmore's ledger pages, the real ones, the ones with the actual figures tucked inside a false bottom in her trunk. She had answered an advertisement in the Missouri Republican, placed by a man named Harold Pickett of Copperfield, Texas, who was looking for a schoolteacher to fill a vacancy left by the departure of the previous one. The salary was modest. The letter of offer was brief. But it was 1,200 miles from St. Louis, and that was the most important qualification it possessed. What she had not known, when she climbed off the stagecoach outside the Copperfield post office and stood blinking in the April heat, was that Harold Pickett had died of a heart attack 3 weeks before her arrival. What she also had not known was that the man who had inherited Harold Pickett's responsibilities as head of the town school board was a rancher by the name of Cutter Dane. The first person to speak to her in Copperfield was not Cutter Dane. It was Noah Ralston. He had been standing near the water trough when the stagecoach rolled in, not loitering but not in any particular hurry either, the way a man stands when he is somewhere between two tasks and has allowed himself a moment of stillness. He was tall, lean in the shoulders, with dark hair that needed cutting and a face that was weathered in the particular way of men who spend most of their time outdoors without thinking much about it. He wore a plain brown vest over a work shirt and the kind of boots that had been repaired at least twice. He was not the most impressive-looking man she had ever seen, but he was the one who noticed that she was struggling with her trunk and stepped forward without being asked. "Let me get that for you," he said, and it was not a question or a performance. It was just a practical offer from a practical man. "Thank you," Violet said, watching him lift it with what appeared to be no effort whatsoever. "I am looking for Harold Pickett." Noah's expression changed in a way that was subtle but unmistakable, a slight tightening around the eyes, a brief recalibration. "Harold passed away," he said, "about 3 weeks ago. Were you the new schoolteacher he wrote for?" "I was," Violet said, and she allowed herself just a moment of quiet despair before she straightened her spine and looked him directly in the eye. "I suppose I need to find whoever is handling his affairs." "That would be the school board," Noah said, "which means Cutter Dane." He paused in a way that felt deliberate. "I can take you to the boarding house first if you like. Give you a chance to settle before you wade into that particular conversation." She had agreed, and he had carried her trunk the 3 blocks to Mrs. Eliza Farrow's boarding house without asking anything else about her, or where she had come from, or why she had traveled all this way to a town she had never heard of. That restraint, that simple, quiet restraint, had struck her as remarkably decent. She had learned his name as he set her trunk down inside the front hallway. He had learned hers. They had stood in the late afternoon light of Mrs. Farrow's entryway for a moment that was just slightly longer than strictly necessary, and then Noah Ralston had touched the brim of his hat and walked back out into the street. She had watched him go from the window and she had thought, well, that was not nothing. The meeting with Cutter Dane the following morning had taken place in the back room of the land office, which Cutter used as a sort of informal throne room. He was the kind of man who occupied space aggressively, who sat behind desks as though he were behind battlements, who smiled in a way that never quite reached his eyes, and yet somehow demanded that you respond to the smile as though it had. He was perhaps 40, heavily built, with a neat mustache and clothes that were a degree too fine for a working rancher. He told Violet that the school board would be reviewing Harold Pickett's hiring decisions and that her position was, for the moment, provisional. He told her she would be paid half salary until the review was complete. He told her this with the kind of seamless cordiality that made it very difficult to object without sounding unreasonable. Violet thanked him and walked back to Mrs. Farrow's boarding house and sat on the edge of her bed and allowed herself exactly 5 minutes to feel the full weight of her situation before she decided to simply get on with it. She opened the school on Monday morning with 17 children in attendance and a determination so complete it felt almost like peace. Noah Ralston she saw again on Wednesday, when she went to the general store owned by a round-faced man named Clement Briggs and found Noah there buying feed, and having what appeared to be a highly detailed disagreement with Clement about the quality of a particular grain shipment. He paused when he saw her, and the disagreement paused with him, and he introduced her to Clement with the easy, natural manner of a man who moved comfortably in his own community. She learned over the following days that Noah owned a cattle ranch about 4 miles outside of town, that he had lived in Copperfield for 8 years, that he had come originally from Tennessee, and that his relationship with Cutter Dane was the kind of cold, carefully maintained antagonism that had deep roots and no easy resolution. She learned this last piece not from Noah himself, but from Mrs. Farrow, who was an efficient and comprehensive source of local information. Cutter Dane wants Noah's water rights, Mrs. Farrow explained one evening over dinner, passing a bowl of potatoes with the calm authority of someone relaying facts that were simply part of the landscape. Noah has a creek running through the north pasture that would be worth more to Cutter's operation than most anything else in this county. Noah won't sell. Hasn't for 3 years. Cutter is not a man accustomed to being told no. Violet filed this away with the careful, systematic attention of a woman who had learned, the hard way, that understanding the structure of a place was the only real protection it offered. She also noticed that Noah came by the school on Thursday afternoon, nominally to fix a hinge on the front door that had been left broken for what appeared to be several months. He fixed it efficiently and without making any ceremony of it, and then he sat on the front steps for a while as the last few children filed out, and Violet sat beside him because the afternoon was warm and she had been inside all day, and they talked. He asked her about St. Louis in the careful way of a man who was curious but did not want to seem as though he was prying. She told him the partial truth, that she had worked as a bookkeeper, that the city had become uncomfortable, that the advertisement had seemed like a reasonable answer to an unreasonable situation. He nodded at this in a way that suggested he understood the logic of leaving a place without requiring her to explain exactly what she had left behind. She asked him about Tennessee. He told her about his family's farm, about coming west when he was 24, about the particular satisfaction of building something in a place that did not already have too much history attached to it. He had a way of talking about the land that was not sentimental but was genuinely affectionate, the way you might speak about a difficult friend whose faults you knew thoroughly and whose company you valued anyway. She walked back to Mrs. Farrow's that evening with her blood doing something she was not entirely prepared for, which was moving faster and in a direction she had not authorized. The following week, Noah came back to fix the window frame. The week after that, he came to repair the chimney flue. By the fourth visit, which involved a loose board in the schoolroom floor that Violet was reasonably certain had not been loose before, she understood that the repairs were at least partially a pretext, and the understanding made her feel something warm and slightly dangerous. They had taken to walking together in the early evenings, when the school day was finished and the heat of the afternoon had begun its slow retreat. They walked along the creek road that ran south of town, where the cottonwood trees were coming into leaf, and the light at that hour had a particular quality, heavy and golden and still, that made everything feel slightly more significant than it perhaps was, or perhaps exactly as significant as it actually was. Violet was no longer entirely certain which. He had not attempted to hold her hand. He had not made any declarations. But there was something between them that was becoming increasingly difficult to describe in neutral terms. A quality of attention, of ease, of a particular kind of pleasure in each other's company that had no practical explanation. She had caught herself, twice, thinking about what it would mean to stay in Copperfield past the school year. She had caught herself thinking about the word permanent in relation to a life she was still constructing. These were not thoughts she had permitted herself since St. Louis, and the fact that they had arrived quietly and without announcement felt significant. And then Cutter Dane came to the school. It was a Tuesday morning, 3 weeks after Violet's arrival. She was writing arithmetic problems on the board when she heard the horse, and looked through the window to see Cutter dismounting with the particular deliberateness of a man who expected to be observed. He came inside without knocking, which told her everything she needed to know about how he intended to conduct himself. The school board review, he told her, was nearly complete. There was just one matter that required resolution. He had received a letter, he said, from a business associate in St. Louis. The letter described a certain Gerald Whitmore and a certain bookkeeper in his employ, and a certain irregularity in the company's financial records. Violet stood very still. Cutter watched her with those flat, smiling eyes. He said that, of course, he was certain there was an explanation. He said that he was a reasonable man. He said that, as it happened, there was a parcel of land adjacent to Noah Ralston's ranch that Cutter had been trying to acquire for some time, and that if Violet were to help facilitate a certain conversation between Cutter and Noah, A meeting, nothing more, just an introduction of a new proposal. Then the letter would simply cease to exist as far as Copperfield was concerned. She told him she would think about it. She walked back to Mrs. Farrow's boarding house that afternoon and sat in her room for a long time, looking at the trunk in the corner with its false bottom and its carefully preserved evidence, thinking about traps and exits and the particular cruelty of being used as an instrument against someone you had begun to care about. She told herself that she would not do it. She was certain of this. She was completely, absolutely certain. And then Cutter sent a second message the following morning. This one was not a suggestion. He had contacted the Copperfield sheriff, he wrote, and provided him with a summary of the allegations from St. Louis. Violet had 48 hours before the matter would be investigated. Unless, of course, she arranged the meeting with Noah. She had the ledger pages. She knew they were her protection, but they were in St. Louis, she thought, and then she remembered that they were not in St. Louis. They were in the false bottom of her trunk, 30 feet away, and she had been so consumed with survival that she had not yet figured out what to do with them. But she did not have time to figure it out now. She had 48 hours and a choice that felt like neither option was truly survivable, and she was terrified, and she made the wrong decision. She found Noah at the livery stable the following morning. She told him that she had heard there was a man interested in discussing a range-sharing arrangement for the northern pasture, and that the man had asked if Noah would be willing to meet at the Silver Creek Saloon that afternoon. She told herself it was just a meeting. She told herself nothing would happen. She told herself that she would find a way to warn Noah once she had a little more time. She had told herself these things all morning, and by the time she arrived at the Silver Creek Saloon and saw Cutter Dane's men already positioned around the room and saw Noah standing at the bar with his back to the door, she understood with absolute clarity and absolute horror that she had not protected Noah at all. She had delivered him. That was the moment. That was the terrible, crystalline moment when everything collapsed into the most important question she had ever faced. She stepped through the door. "Noah," she said, and Cutter smiled, and Noah looked at her with those dark eyes full of a trust that was in the process of becoming something else entirely. "You walked right into it," Cutter said, "and she brought you here herself." The silence in the saloon stretched and tightened. Violet moved. She did not plan it, did not calculate it, did not think about consequences. She simply walked across the room toward Cutter Dane, putting herself between him and Noah with a directness that clearly surprised everyone in the room, including herself. "I will not be used any further," she said. Her voice was steady. She had not expected it to be steady. "And if you shoot that man, Cutter, then every piece of evidence I have about Gerald Whitmore and your involvement with his fraud against those rail worker families will be in the hands of the county sheriff before nightfall." The room went very quiet. Cutter's expression did not change immediately. Then something shifted in it, a recalculation, a wariness, the first genuine uncertainty she had seen from him. "You don't have anything," he said. "I have ledger pages," Violet said. "Original ledger pages with figures that match the amended settlement records. And before you consider whether you can find them before I can act on them, I have already written a letter to a contact in Austin describing their contents and their location, which will be opened in the event that anything happens to me or to Noah Ralston." This last part was not entirely true. The letter did not exist. But the ledger pages were real, and the connection between Cutter Dane and Gerald Whitmore, which she had only suspected until Cutter's own careless reference to his St. Louis business associate, was now confirmed, and Cutter could not know how much she actually knew or how much she had documented. The gun at Noah's chest did not lower immediately. But Cutter's eyes moved, calculating, and in the calculation Violet saw the one crack in the wall she needed. "Lower the gun, Cutter," she said quietly. "Let him walk out of here, and then you and I are going to have a conversation about what happens next." Noah's voice, when it came, was quiet and controlled and absolutely furious. "Violet." "I know," she said without looking at him. "I know, please walk out." "I am not walking out and leaving you in here with Noah." She turned to look at him then fully and let him see her face without any pretense or concealment. "I am asking you to trust me. I understand if you cannot, but I am asking." He looked at her for a long moment. Cutter's man still had the gun raised. The afternoon light lay in thick bars across the saloon floor. Outside, a dog barked twice and then was quiet. Noah Ralston walked out of the saloon. The conversation with Cutter Dane that followed was not pleasant, but it was productive in the way that conversations between people who both have something to lose tend to be productive. Violet laid out, in precise and controlled terms, what she knew, what she had documented, and what she was willing to do. She also laid out what she wanted. Cutter would withdraw his complaint to the sheriff, restore her full salary, and relinquish any claim on Noah Ralston's water rights. Cutter was not a man who liked losing, but he was a man who understood leverage, and the leverage had shifted. He agreed. She walked out of the Silver Creek Saloon into the late afternoon sun and found Noah Ralston waiting on the boardwalk across the street, leaning against the post of the hardware store with his arms crossed and an expression that was equal parts relief and barely contained anger. She crossed the street and stopped in front of him and said, "I owe you an explanation." "I expect you do," he said. They walked to the creek road. She told him everything: Gerald Whitmore, the fraud, the real ledger pages, the way Cutter had used that information to back her into a corner. She told him about the letter from St. Louis and the 48-hour ultimatum, and the conversation she had not had with herself honestly enough before she had made the decision to lure him to that saloon. She did not soften any of it or explain it away. She told it plainly, the way things that are shameful tend to be easier to bear when they are spoken plainly. He listened without interrupting, which she appreciated. He did not look at her while she talked. He looked at the creek, which was moving clear and quick in the late afternoon light, and she watched his profile and tried to read it and could not. When she finished, there was silence. "You should have told me," he said at last. "Yes," she said. "From the beginning, the first morning," he paused, "I would have helped you." "I know that now," she said. "I was not certain of it then. I did not know you then. I had just come from a place where trusting people had not served me particularly well." He turned to look at her, and his expression was complicated frustration and something underneath it that was softer and more difficult to name. "You could have been hurt," he said, "walking into that room like that." "So could you," she said, "and that was my fault." "It was Cutter Dane's fault," Noah said firmly. "Let's be clear about that." She felt something loosen in her chest that she had not realized had been pulled tight. "I still should have told you." "Yes," he said again. "You should have," and then, after a moment, "Do not do anything like that again." "I will try not to arrange any further traps," she said, with a dryness she had not entirely intended. The corner of his mouth moved in a way that, under other circumstances, she thought might have become a smile. "The ledger pages," he said, "they're real. They are real. They are in my trunk at Mrs. Farrow's. Then they need to go somewhere safer. I know a judge in San Antonio, a federal circuit judge. He has no connection to Cutter or to Whitmore." "That would put an end to the whole matter," she said slowly. "Whitmore, the fraud, all of it. That is generally what I have in mind, yes." He looked at her steadily. "If you want to end it." She thought about the families of those dead rail workers. She thought about the settlements they had never received, the women left without financial protection, the children left without resources. She had been carrying those ledger pages for 2 years because she had not known what to do with them and had been too frightened to act. She looked at Noah Ralston's direct, serious face and she thought, here is someone who knows how to finish things. "Yes," she said, "I want to end it." He arranged a courier to San Antonio within the week, with copies of the ledger pages sent by 2 separate routes to ensure at least one arrived. He also, quietly and without making any performance of it, had a conversation with 3 other ranchers in the county about Cutter Dane's pattern of behavior, the pressure tactics, the land acquisition by coercion, the connections to Whitmore's operation in St. Louis. He was not doing this for Violet alone. He had been watching Cutter Dane for years, and he understood that the crack she had made in that wall was the first real opening anyone had managed. Violet threw herself back into the school with an intensity that had something liberating in it, the particular freedom of a person who has, for the first time in a long time, nothing left to hide. She was good at teaching, genuinely and naturally good at it, in a way that surprised even her. She liked the children. She liked the rhythm of the day, the accumulation of small progresses, the particular satisfaction of watching a child's face shift from confusion to understanding. She and Noah fell back into their evening walks with a difference in the quality of the air between them. Something that had been guarded was now slightly more open, as though the crisis in the saloon had stripped away a protective coating that had been necessary before but was no longer. They talked differently, more directly, with less navigation around the edges of things. He told her about his wife, who had died 4 years ago of a fever, a young woman named Clara who had come west with him and had loved the ranch and had been, in his words, someone he was not finished with when she was taken. He said this without drama, with the quiet of a man who has done most of his grieving and is now in the phase where the absence is a fixture rather than a wound. But she could hear in the straightforward, careful way he spoke about it that it had changed him, and that the change was part of who he was now, the way scar tissue is part of a body. She told him about her own romantic history, which was brief and uncomplicated. A young man in St. Louis, a clerk at the shipping company, who had liked her very much and whose liking had not survived the Whitmore scandal. She told this with more lightness than she felt, because it still stung slightly, not the loss of the man specifically but the confirmation of how quickly affection could turn conditional. "That is not affection," Noah said flatly. "That is just convenience wearing affection's clothes." She looked at him. "That is either a very wise observation or a very cynical one." "Little bit of both," he said, with the particular directness she had come to recognize as one of his essential qualities. It was on a Thursday evening, the 5th week, when he reached over and took her hand while they were walking. He did not make anything of it. He did not comment on it. He simply took her hand in the easy, unhurried way of someone who has decided that something is true and is now proceeding on that basis. She let herself hold his hand back, and they walked along the creek road in the last of the evening light, and she thought about the word permanent again, and this time she did not push it away. The reply from San Antonio came in the following week, carried by a rider from the Federal Circuit Court's office. Judge Archibald Tanner had received the ledger pages. He had, in fact, been building a related case against Gerald Whitmore for some months on behalf of a group of widows who had retained a lawyer in Austin. Violet's evidence was, the judge wrote, the piece that had been missing. He thanked her in formal but genuine terms and advised that both Whitmore and his associates, including a certain land speculator with connections in Copperfield, Texas, would be subject to federal investigation within 60 days. She read the letter 3 times in her room at Mrs. Farrow's, and then she sat down on the edge of her bed and cried for about 10 minutes, which she felt she had fully earned. Then she walked the 4 miles to Noah's ranch to tell him. She had not been to the ranch before. It was a handsome place in the way that working things can be handsome, not decorative, not designed for appearance, but proportioned well and kept with a care that was evident in every detail. The house was timber and adobe, low and solid, with a wide covered porch and a garden on the south side where someone had planted things that were just beginning to come up. The barn was larger than the house, which she felt was right for a cattle ranch. Noah was in the yard when she arrived, working on a section of fence with a hired hand named Julio, a compact, serious young man from Sonora who greeted Violet with a respectful nod and found somewhere else to be with remarkable efficiency. She told Noah about the letter. He read it twice, which was his habit with important documents. Then he looked at her with an expression she had not seen from him before, not quite relief, not quite triumph, but something that was bigger and quieter than either of those things. "It is over," she said. "The Whitmore part is over," he said. "The Cutter Dane part is going to take a little longer." "But it is started," she said. "It is started," he agreed. They were standing close together in the yard, the afternoon sun warm on their backs, the sound of the cattle in the south pasture, a low, constant presence. He had not let go of the letter. She had not moved back from the proximity the conversation had drawn them to. He said, without particular ceremony, "I would like you to stay in Copperfield." "I have a teaching position," she said. "I do not mean the teaching position," he said. She looked at him. He looked back at her with that steady, direct attention that she had catalogued and categorized over 5 weeks and still found entirely disarming. "That is not the most elaborately constructed declaration I have ever heard," she said. "No," he agreed, "but it is honest." "Yes," she said, "it is that." She reached up and straightened the lapel of his vest, which did not need straightening, and he covered her hand with his before she could lower it, and she left her hand there, warm against his chest, and they stayed like that for a moment in the afternoon sun with the cattle in the distance and the smell of grass and dust and spring in the air around them. "I would like to stay in Copperfield," she said. He brought her hand to his mouth and pressed his lips against her knuckles, which was the most romantic thing anyone had ever done for her, and she thought this because the gesture was so entirely characteristic of him. Not performed, not theatrical, just a direct expression of something real, and she felt herself tipping past the careful, measured thing she had been maintaining and into something that was warmer and more unguarded and entirely, completely herself. He walked her back to town in the early evening, and he held her hand the entire way, and they talked about nothing in particular, the school, the ranch, a traveling circus that was reportedly coming through in July, a book she had been reading, a horse he was thinking of acquiring, and it was the easiest conversation she had ever had with anyone. At the gate of Mrs. Farrow's boarding house, he kissed her. It was a brief, serious kiss, the kind that is nothing like a question and everything like an answer. She stood on her toes to meet him, and his hands were gentle on either side of her face, and the evening was soft around them, and when it ended she kept her eyes closed for a moment because she was not quite ready for the world to reassert itself. "Good evening, Miss Mercer," he said. "Good evening, Mr. Ralston," she said. She went inside and stood in the hallway for a moment feeling entirely ridiculous in the best possible way, and Mrs. Farrow, who had been in the parlor with improbably good sightlines to the front gate, appeared in the doorway with the expression of a woman who has been waiting for this particular development for some time. "Well," Mrs. Farrow said. "Good evening, Mrs. Farrow," Violet said, and went upstairs. The federal investigation moved faster than anyone had anticipated. Within 3 weeks of the letter from Judge Tanner, 2 federal marshals arrived in Copperfield with papers for Cutter Dane. The charges were numerous and specific, and included not only his involvement in the Whitmore fraud, but a separate and equally damning set of transactions involving falsified land deeds in 3 Texas counties. The town received this news with a variety of reactions: shock, satisfaction, the particular kind of retrospective clarity, where people begin to remember things about a man that they had not previously allowed themselves to name. Cutter Dane was taken to San Antonio for trial. He did not return to Copperfield. Gerald Whitmore faced separate proceedings in St. Louis and was subsequently stripped of his business license, his assets frozen, and the fraudulent settlements ordered to be paid with interest to the families of the deceased rail workers. When Violet received word of this from Judge Tanner's office, she read the letter to her class of 17 children because she thought it was a story worth knowing. That evidence kept and protected could matter, that doing the right thing belatedly was still better than not doing it at all. The children were largely more interested in arithmetic, but she counted it as a worthwhile lesson regardless. The school board, with Cutter's influence removed, voted unanimously to confirm Violet's full-time position and to approve a modest increase in salary that would allow her to think about something more permanent than a room in Mrs. Farrow's boarding house. Noah came to find her the afternoon after the school board vote, riding into town with a purposefulness that Mrs. Farrow observed from her parlor window, and described to Violet approximately 45 seconds after Violet had already seen him herself. They walked to the creek road, as had become their practice, and the cottonwood trees were in full leaf now, the creek running clear in the June afternoon. She told him about the school board decision. He listened with the particular quality of attention he gave to things that mattered to him, which was a form of attention she had come to think of as one of his finest qualities. The complete, ungrudging focus of a man who does not give it to everything, and therefore makes its presence felt. "You are staying," he said. "I am staying," she agreed. They stopped walking. They were at the wide bend in the creek where the bank was flat and the cottonwoods made a canopy, and the light was coming through the leaves in that shifting, dappled way that makes everything look like something from a painting. Noah turned to face her. He had the look of a man who has been thinking about something carefully for some time and has now arrived at the point of saying it. "I want to ask you something," he said, "and I want you to know that I am not asking because the timing seems convenient or because things have settled in a comfortable way. I have been thinking about this since the third or fourth time I walked back from the school and realized that the distance back to the ranch felt genuinely unreasonable." Violet felt her chest do the thing it did around him, which was become warm and slightly too large for its usual dimensions. "I am not a particularly demonstrative man," he continued. "I expect you have noticed that." "I have noticed that you fixed 7 things at the school that were not broken," she said. The corner of his mouth moved. "5 of them were broken," he said. "The other 2 were heading that direction." "Noah," she said gently. "Violet," he said, and said her name in the particular way he had, which was as though it was a complete and sufficient sentence. He took both her hands in his. "I am asking you to marry me, not because it is the sensible next step, though it is. Not because I think you need anything from me, because I do not think that. I think you are one of the most capable people I have ever met, and the fact that you need things the same as everyone else does not diminish that at all. I am asking because I am in love with you, and I have been in love with you with increasing certainty since approximately the 2nd week, and I would like to spend the rest of my life in that condition, if you are willing." She stood in the cottonwood light by the creek in Copperfield, Texas, in the summer of 1881, holding the hands of Noah Ralston, and she thought about St. Louis and the ledger pages and the long, frightened stagecoach ride and the $42 sewn into her hem, and she thought, "I came all this way for this exact moment, even though I did not know it when I started." "Yes," she said, "I am willing." He kissed her there by the creek with considerably more enthusiasm than the brief, serious kiss at Mrs. Farrow's gate, and she kissed him back with equal enthusiasm, and a horse on the road above the bank chose this moment to make its presence known in a way that suggested it disapproved, and they separated laughing, which she thought was probably the best possible ending to a proposal. They were married in October. The wedding was small and genuine, held at the Copperfield Presbyterian Church on a morning when the sky was the particular deep blue of a Texas autumn, and the air had finally given up its summer heat without entirely committing to winter. Mrs. Farrow wept with great productivity. Julio and 2 of the other ranch hands from the Ralston property stood in the back of the church in their good shirts and looked proud. Clement Briggs, the general store owner, brought a wedding gift of impractical but appreciated extravagance. The vows were spoken clearly and without stumbling, by 2 people who meant every word. Violet moved to the ranch. She kept her teaching position, which Noah supported without reservation, and with the practical assistance of ensuring that the schoolhouse chimney, door hinges, window frames, and floor boards remained in excellent working order, which meant he was there most afternoons anyway, and the arrangement suited both of them considerably. She loved the ranch in the same way he had described loving it, not sentimentally but genuinely, with an appreciation for the scale of it and the rhythm of it, and the way it made demands that were honest and specific and met with clear results. She helped with the accounts, which were a source of some disorganization that Noah acknowledged cheerfully and which she remedied with quiet, methodical efficiency. She planted more things in the garden on the south side of the house. She learned to ride with competence if not elegance. They were happy. Not in the uninterrupted, frictionless way of stories that have simplified themselves for convenience, but in the full, complicated, deeply satisfying way of two people who have found each other at the right time and are smart enough to know it and careful enough to tend it. The winter of 1881 was cold, and had one blizzard that kept them indoors for 3 days with nothing to do but talk and read and play cards, and Violet thought afterward that if she had to construct an ideal 3 days it would look something like those 3 days. Noah beat her at cards with a regularity that she found irritating, and that he found endearing, which she thought said something accurate about both their characters. In the spring of 1882, she told him she was expecting a child. He was at the kitchen table when she told him, going through the week's accounts, and he was still for a moment in a way that she could not immediately read. Then he stood up from the table and crossed the kitchen and put his arms around her with a thoroughness and gentleness combined that she felt from the top of her head to the soles of her feet. "Are you well?" he asked. His voice was different, lower and more careful than usual. "I am very well," she said into his shoulder. "Good," he said. "That is very good." He held her for a long moment. Then, "I had better fix the roof over the back bedroom." She laughed, which she had a feeling she would be doing for the rest of her life. The baby arrived in November, a boy, red-faced and furious, and possessed of a remarkable quantity of dark hair that was clearly inherited from his father. They named him James, after Noah's father. He was healthy and loud, and consumed an amount of energy and attention that Violet had not fully anticipated, and she found this delightful rather than depleting, which she took as a good sign about her constitution as a mother. Noah with the baby was something she had not prepared herself for. He was not demonstrative in the theatrical way, but he was present in the way that mattered completely, consistently, with his full attention. And she watched him with James and felt something in her chest that was so large it sometimes felt like it occupied the whole room. Julio, who had become in practice something close to family in the years since Violet's arrival, took to James with the seriousness of a man who had decided that this child was now one of his responsibilities, and treated the role with the same competent dedication he applied to everything else on the ranch. The Whitmore case concluded in St. Louis in the summer of 1883 with convictions on 6 counts of fraud. The families of the rail workers received their settlements. Violet received a formal letter of acknowledgement from Judge Tanner, which she framed and hung in the schoolroom, not because it was particularly decorative, but because she thought it was worth the children seeing that evidence of justice was available. Cutter Dane's trial in San Antonio resulted in a sentence of 12 years. His ranch was sold to cover legal damages, and the proceeds distributed to a number of people he had defrauded over the years, including several Copperfield families who had not known until the investigation revealed it that they had been cheated. The land that Cutter had tried to acquire from Noah, the parcel adjacent to the north pasture, came up for legitimate sale in the settlement proceedings, and Noah bought it at a fair price. He showed Violet the deed on a Sunday afternoon, turning it over in his hands with the quiet satisfaction of a man who has resolved something that had been unresolved for too long. "The water rights are secured," he said. "They were never not secured," she said. "You held them." "Holding something and not having to fight for it anymore are different conditions," he said. She took the deed from his hands and set it on the table and kissed him, and he pulled her close in the way he had that felt entirely like home. And outside the window the north pasture ran green to the creek, and the sky was very blue, and the cattle moved in the distance like slow thoughts, and James was asleep in the back bedroom, and everything was, at that particular moment, exactly as it should be. Life on the Ralston Ranch continued to grow and deepen in the years that followed, not dramatically but steadily, the way good things tend to grow. in small increments that are difficult to track individually, but that accumulate into something substantial and undeniable when you pause to look at what you have built. Violet continued teaching, and the school grew with the town. Copperfield itself was changing in the early 1880s. The railroad had reached a town 20 miles to the east, which brought new families, new trade, and a certain amount of new energy that was both welcome and occasionally exhausting. The school added a second room in 1883, and Violet took on an assistant, a young woman newly arrived from Kansas City named Helen Park, who was earnest and hardworking and slightly overwhelmed, and whom Violet mentored with the particular warmth of a person who remembers what it felt like to arrive somewhere new and uncertain. She and Noah celebrated their 5th anniversary in October of 1886 with a dinner at Mrs. Farrow's boarding house, which had become a tradition. Mrs. Farrow refused to hear of any other arrangement and set a table that was deeply and affectionately excessive, with the kind of food that took all day to prepare and was consumed in a state of helpless gratitude. James, by this time, was 4 years old and thoroughly convinced of his own authority over all proceedings. He had Noah's dark hair and Violet's green eyes, and a combination of temperaments from both of them that manifested as a child, who was simultaneously very determined and very interested in understanding why things worked the way they did. Noah took him out to the ranch work whenever the task was safe enough, and James was of the firm opinion that he was considerably more capable than anyone gave him credit for. Mrs. Farrow, at the 5th anniversary dinner, raised her glass and made a toast that was both sincere and slightly embarrassing in its completeness, mentioning the first day she had watched Violet come through her front door with nothing but $42 and a traveling trunk, and watching Noah walk back out into the street with the expression of a man who had just remembered something he had not been looking for. She had eyes like a hawk and a memory like a courthouse record, did Mrs. Farrow, and the table was warm and bright, and full of people who had become, over 5 years, something like a family. Noah told Violet, walking home that night under a sky full of November stars with James asleep on his shoulder, that he was the luckiest man in Copperfield, which she took to be sincere since he was not given to overstatement. "I think we are both fairly lucky," she said. "I was doing reasonably fine on my own," he said, "but this is considerably better." "High praise," she said, and he caught her hand and brought it to his lips in the gesture she had never once stopped finding completely, absolutely devastating, and she walked beside him through the cold Texas night with his hand warm in hers and thought, "Yes, this is it. This is the thing." In the spring of 1887, Violet discovered she was expecting again. She told Noah the same way she had told him about James, directly, without ceremony, and he responded in essentially the same way, which was to go completely still for a moment and then close the distance between them with an immediacy that made words unnecessary. "Are you well?" he asked, exactly as before. "Extremely well," she said. "Good," he said. "That is very good." He pulled back to look at her. "I am going to fix the roof on the east side." "The roof is fine," she said. "It will be better after I fix it," he said. James, informed that he was going to have a sibling, received this news with the suspicious pragmatism of a 4-year-old who was not entirely certain this development served his interests. He spent approximately 1 week in this posture before deciding, upon Violet's patient explanation, that having someone to instruct was probably going to be worthwhile. The second baby arrived in October of 1887, a girl this time, who arrived with the same dark hair and the same air of categorical authority that seemed to be a feature of Ralston children. They named her Eleanor, after Violet's grandmother, who had been a woman of considerable character whom Violet had adored. Eleanor proved, in the months following her arrival, to be precisely as characterful as her namesake. Noah with Eleanor was, if possible, even more affecting than Noah with James had been, which Violet had not thought mathematically possible. He was the same, unhurried, consistent, completely present, but there was something in the way he held his daughter that was its own particular landscape, and Violet sometimes stood in the doorway of the evening room just to watch it for a moment before making her presence known. James adjusted to Alina with the grace of a child who has decided that the new situation is workable and has therefore resolved to work it. He was, by the time Alina was old enough to interact with any coherence, devoted to her in the slightly bossier elder sibling mode that Violet thought was entirely appropriate, and that Noah managed with a gentle even-handedness that she deeply admired. The ranch continued to prosper. The expanded pasture to the north, the water rights secure, the operation running with the practical efficiency that came from Noah's management and Violet's accounting, had grown to a scale that supported a small permanent crew. Julio was by now the foreman, a role he inhabited with the same unshowy competence that had characterized everything he did, and the ranch's reputation in the county was for quality cattle and fair dealing, which were the only reputations Noah had ever wanted. Violet's position at the school had evolved over the years into something that was equal parts teaching and advocacy. She had, in the years since Cutter Dane's removal, worked with the county on establishing better access to schooling for the children of families who lived farther out on the range, and she had found in this work a satisfaction that complemented the work in the classroom without replacing it. She was also, by 1888, helping the new county superintendent develop a curriculum that would serve a broader range of students, including the children of Mexican families who had been in this region far longer than most of the Anglo settlers, and whose presence and contributions were acknowledged with insufficient frequency in the existing educational structure. This work sometimes brought her into disagreement with people who were comfortable with how things were and resistant to changes, and she navigated these disagreements with the combination of principled firmness and diplomatic patience that came naturally to a woman who had faced down Cutter Dane with a bluff and a set of ledger pages. Noah supported her in this work as he supported her in everything, not by managing it or directing it, but by making clear, in the practical and consistent ways that were his nature, that her judgment was sound and her efforts were worth the difficulty. He came to school board meetings when she asked him to, which was when his presence was useful, and he did not come when it would have suggested that she needed someone to speak on her behalf, because she did not. He was, in this as in all things, exactly the person she had needed him to be, not because he had made himself into something for her, but because he already was what she had needed, and had been waiting with the patience of a man who did not realize he was waiting. On a Sunday morning in the spring of 1889, Noah found her in the garden on the south side of the house, where she was doing the spring planting with Alina beside her, passing seeds with intense seriousness, and James slightly farther back, showing Julio how to correctly tie a particular knot, which Julio was receiving with admirable patience. Noah sat down on the porch step and watched all of this, his wife with her hands in the earth, his daughter concentrating on seeds, his son instructing a grown man who could run a cattle operation with his eyes closed, and Violet looked up and caught him watching, and the expression on his face was one she had learned to recognize over 8 years of marriage. "What are you thinking about?" she asked. "Just this," he said. She sat back on her heels and looked at him. This man she had married in the full knowledge of who he was, and who had known her in the full knowledge of who she was. This man whose water rights were secure, and whose cattle were healthy, and who fixed things that did not need fixing as a form of devotion. And she thought about the stagecoach, and the $42 and the advertisement in the Missouri Republican and the long, terrifying road that had led directly here, to this garden, to this porch step, to this man's face in the spring light. "Just this," she agreed. Alina handed her a seed with great ceremony, and she planted it with appropriate gravity, and Noah watched from the porch step with that expression, and Giulio completed the knot lesson with the private amusement of a man who found the whole arrangement deeply satisfying, and the afternoon moved around them warm and unhurried and entirely complete. That summer, a letter arrived from Austin. The County Education Board had proposed Violet for a newly created position, the first county-wide supervisor of primary education, responsible for overseeing the development and quality of schooling across a district that covered 7 towns and the surrounding range. The letter was formal and professional and concluded with a salary figure that made Violet sit down at the kitchen table and read the whole thing again from the beginning. She brought the letter to Noah that evening. He read it with his characteristic steadiness, turned it over, turned it back, and set it on the table between them. "This is what you have been working toward," he said. "Some version of it," she said. "It would mean more travel. It would mean I could not be at the school every day." "Helen Park can run the school," he said. "She has been ready for 2 years. It would mean some time in Austin." "Not all the time," he said, looking at the letter again. "No. The position is based in Copperfield. The travel is periodic." He looked at her directly. "Then I do not understand the hesitation." "There is no hesitation," she said. "I am just thinking about it carefully." "You have already decided," he said, with the certainty of a man who knows the person he is talking to. She looked at him across the table, the evening light settling around them, the distant sounds of James and Alina in the backyard filtering through the window. She thought about Gerald Whitmore and the ledger pages, and the decisions made in fear versus the decisions made from a place of solid ground. She thought about how different those felt. She thought about how long it had taken her to arrive at a place where she had solid ground to stand on, and what it meant to stand on it. "I have already decided," she agreed. She wrote back to Austin the following morning. The position changed things in the practical way that new responsibilities change things. There were days that were longer and more complicated than she would have chosen, trips to neighboring towns that took her away for 2 or 3 days at a stretch, a wider web of relationships and negotiations and compromises that required more of her time and energy and judgment than any single classroom had. But it also changed things in the larger sense, the way that work which matters changes the person who does it, and she found, over the months and then the years of the work, that she had more capacity for it than she had known, and that the satisfaction it produced was of a kind that went very deep. Noah managed the ranch and managed James and Alina during the weeks when her work took her farther afield, and he did this with the same unhurried, capable steadiness that he applied to everything. He wrote to her when she was away brief, factual letters that were also somehow deeply warm, the same way he was himself, containing practical information about the ranch and the children, and occasionally a single, direct sentence at the end that was purely emotional in a way the rest of the letter was not. And these letters she kept in a box in the bedroom because she had learned by now what they were worth. She wrote back at length because she was a person who thought on paper, and her letters to him were full of the details of the work, and the people she met and the things she observed and the occasional absurdity of bureaucratic process. And she knew he read them carefully because he asked specific questions when she returned. The children grew. James, at 10, was already helping with the ranch work in a real and substantive way, with the particular combination of his father's practical focus and his mother's analytical habits that made him both reliable and interesting to work alongside. He had also developed an unexpected passion for mathematics, which Violet took a private maternal pleasure in without mentioning it in a way that would have been insufferable. Alina, at 8, had decided that she was going to be a doctor, which she had announced at dinner one evening with the calmness of a person reporting a fact that has already been settled. Neither Noah nor Violet had expressed anything other than straightforward support for this position, which pleased Alina and had evidently not been the reaction she had anticipated, because she had prepared several arguments for it that she did not get to use, and had seemed faintly disappointed by the lack of resistance. "Did you have arguments ready?" Violet had asked afterward. "Several," Eleanor said. "You should have pushed back. I had very good arguments." "I am sure you did," Violet said. "Your father and I will arrange to have doubts at a convenient time so you can deploy them." Eleanor considered this seriously. "Tuesday might work," she said. In 1891, the ranch celebrated its 20th year under Noah's ownership, or rather, Noah noted the anniversary quietly to Violet one morning over coffee, which was the version of celebration that suited him. She had bought him a new surveying compass that he had mentioned needing, wrapped in newspaper, and given it to him with a directness that matched his own, and he had looked at it and looked at her, and said thank you in the particular way he had that was always more than those two words contained. Mrs. Farrow, who had become by now something close to a grandmother to James and Eleanor, had a fall that winter that concerned everyone and from which she recovered with characteristic stubbornness, and the family took to spending more time at the boarding house over the following months, which suited everyone. Mrs. Farrow was sharper and funnier than ever, and her memory of Violet's arrival in Copperfield had achieved the quality of a favorite family story, retold with small elaborations that changed slightly each time, but whose emotional truth remained entirely accurate. Spring of 1892 brought an unexpected grace to the Ralston Ranch, in the form of a mare that Noah had been negotiating to acquire for over a year finally coming available, and the mare turned out to be pregnant, which he had not known, and the foal was born in May with Eleanor present, because she had insisted on being there for medical observation purposes, and had been utterly unable to pretend she was not also completely overwhelmed by the whole thing. Violet had stood in the barn doorway watching her daughter watch the foal come into the world, and Noah had come to stand beside her, and the barn was warm with the smell of hay and animals and the particular quality of late spring air, and they stood together in the way they had learned to stand together, close, easy, without words necessary. "She is going to be a very good doctor," Noah said quietly. "She is going to be terrifying," Violet said. "Those are not mutually exclusive," he said. They were quiet for a moment, watching Eleanor, who was now asking Julio detailed questions about the foal's breathing. "Noah," Violet said. "Yes." She looked at him, at the profile she had now known for over 10 years, at the lines that the sun and the work and the time had added, and that she loved as specifically as she loved anything, as specifically as she loved the way he said her name, as specifically as she loved the care with which he did things, as specifically as she loved the steady, unperformative certainty of being entirely known by someone and entirely chosen. "I am glad the roof needed fixing," she said. He turned to look at her, and he smiled, the full smile, which she had learned over 10 years was not the kind he gave frequently, and which, when it appeared, was worth the whole effort of everything that had come before. "It was heading that direction," he said. She laughed, which she had known she would, and he took her hand in the way he had taken it on the creek road the first time, easy and unhurried, and on the basis that it was simply true. And they stood in the barn doorway in the spring evening while their daughter interrogated Julio about respiratory rates, and their son came running across the yard to see the foal, and the mare stood quiet in the lamplight, and the whole, full, genuine, entirely satisfying fact of their life was present in that barn doorway. Every piece of it earned and chosen and real. In the years that followed, Violet's work with the county education system continued to grow in its reach and its effect. By 1895, a generation of children across 7 towns in the county were receiving schooling that was broader and fairer, and more complete than what had been available when she had arrived in Copperfield 14 years earlier. She had not done this alone. She had done it with teachers and board members and community figures, and a federal education fund that had taken 3 years and considerable correspondence to access. But the shape of it, the structure and the insistence and the refusal to accept the minimum where better was possible, those things had Violet's particular quality of thought all through them, and people who worked in that county's schools knew it. Noah expanded the ranch operation in 1895 as well, taking on a partnership with a neighboring rancher to develop a cooperative arrangement for the cattle drive to market that benefited both operations and reduced the risk that individual ranchers carried alone. It was the kind of practical, equitable arrangement that he approached naturally, because he had always been more interested in lasting solutions than in short-term advantage. James, 17 by then, had become a genuinely indispensable part of the ranch. He had his father's instinct for the land and the cattle and had also, unexpectedly, developed his mother's talent for accounts and negotiation, so that the combination was formidably useful. He was a quiet young man, deeply observant, with a dry humor that emerged when you had known him long enough to recognize it, and Noah treated him with the particular respect of a father who has noticed that his child has become a person. Eleanor, 15, was still entirely committed to medicine and had expanded her self-education on the subject through every book and journal she could acquire, which in Copperfield in 1895 was limited but not nothing, and through a correspondence she had begun with a woman doctor in Philadelphia whose lecture she had read in a medical journal. She was also, despite, or perhaps because of the categorical certainty of her ambitions, developing a social life that Violet observed with affectionate attention and that Noah observed with the slightly more complex attention of a father. Mrs. Farrow died in the winter of 1896, peacefully and in her own bed, and Copperfield mourned her in the genuine, complete way that a community mourns someone who has been its texture for a generation. Violet sat with her in the last days and held her hand and talked to her about everything and nothing, and Mrs. Farrow, when she was lucid, talked about the afternoon she had watched Violet come through her front door with $42 and a traveling trunk. "I knew," Mrs. Farrow said, on the last afternoon she was fully present, "I knew from the first minute." "Knew what?" Violet asked. "That you were going to be exactly right for this place," Mrs. Farrow said. "And that this place was going to be exactly right for you." She died the following morning, and the boarding house went to a niece in Dallas who sold it, and the front gate where Noah had kissed Violet for the first time became part of a hardware store's expansion, which Violet thought Mrs. Farrow would have found moderately funny. The family turned the corner into the 20th century together. In the summer of 1900, the household had changed in shape, but not in essential quality. James, 22, was running the ranch alongside Noah with a capability that had made Noah's direct daily involvement in the hardest physical work less necessary, which Noah accepted with the grace of a man who is genuinely pleased to see what he has made continue without him. Eleanor had gone to Philadelphia in 1898 to pursue medical training, one of the first women admitted to the program she attended, a fact she reported in her letters with the dry understatement of a person for whom facts were sufficient without decoration. Violet and Noah were, in the summer of 1900, 50 and 53, which was not old by any absolute measure, but was old enough to carry a sense of the full arc of things, to feel the particular weight of a life lived with intention, and to appreciate what that weight contained. They walked the creek road that summer evening the same way they had walked it almost 20 years earlier, and the cottonwood trees were enormous now, full and deep-rooted, and the creek moved as it always had, clear and quick over its pale bed. Noah held her hand in the same easy, certain way, and she leaned into his shoulder the way she had come to lean into him over the years, with the ease of something that has become entirely natural. "Do you remember," she said, "the $42? You have mentioned them approximately once per year since the wedding," he said. "They were significant," she said. "They were," he agreed. "They brought you here." She stopped walking and turned to look at him, this man, her person, her home, and the evening light of the Texas summer was doing what it always did at this hour, which was lay itself across everything with a generosity that made the world look like something deserving of gratitude. "Noah Ralston," she said. "Violet Ralston," he said, with the particular warm specificity he gave her name. She took his face in her hands, which she had not done standing on a road since the very early days, and kissed him in the way of people who have kissed each other 10,000 times and still find this particular one worth attending to. He kissed her back with the same attention. The cottonwood trees stood in the evening. The creek ran over its pale stones. The cattle moved in the distance. James was home from the day's work by now, and Alina was in Philadelphia becoming a doctor, and Mrs. Farrow was gone, and Cutter Dane was a resolved chapter in a very long story, and Gerald Whitmore's victims had their settlements, and the school in Copperfield had 2 rooms and a good teacher, and the ranch had water rights secure and pasture enough, and a foal that was now a 7-year-old horse that Alina had named with the gravity she applied to all medical nomenclature. Everything was closed. Everything was resolved. Everything was, in the full and accurate sense of the word, complete. They walked back to the ranch in the deepening evening, Violet and Noah, hand in hand on the creek road as the first stars appeared over Copperfield, Texas, and the world they had built together held them as they moved through it, solid, true, and entirely their own.